Hello, everybody. Welcome back for another brand new episode. I'm your host, Larry Lease. Today, we're talking about one of the biggest, loudest, most argued about conspiracy theories in modern history, and that is the moon landing. Was Apollo 11 one of the greatest achievements in human history, or was it one fake propaganda tool? Now, let me say this right at the start. I do not believe the moon landing was fake. I know that ruins the suspense for some people, but I'd rather be honest with you from the beginning. To me, the biggest problem with the moon landing hoax theory is not even the flag, the shadows, the stars, or the photographs. The biggest problem is the number of people who have had to stay quiet for this long. We're talking about thousands and thousands of people: NASA employees, engineers, contractors, military personnel, communication teams, scientists, astronauts, families, government officials. And then you have the Soviets, who had every reason in the world to expose America if it was fake. The US had staged the whole thing. The Soviet Union would not just quietly sat there and said, "Oh, congratulations." They would have blasted that story across every newspaper and radio station, embassy they could find. They have used it as proof that America was lying to the world. But they did not. And that matters. Because during the Cold War, the moon landing was not just about science, not just about exploration. It was not just about a few astronauts bouncing around on gray dust while the world watched in black and white. It was about power. It was about prestige. It was about which system, American democracy, Soviet communism, could claim the future. So today, we're going to walk through the official story, look at the conspiracy theories, examine the evidence, and ask the question that has hung over this topic for decades. Did we really land on the moon? On July 22nd, 1969, in the early hours of the morning, a 5-year-old girl was gently woken up by her father. He told her to stay quiet. He told her not to wake the younger child. And together, they made their way downstairs into the living room. She was tired, half asleep, probably confused. She asked him what was happening. Her father told her something along the lines of, "You need to see this. This is going to be one of the biggest moments in the history of mankind. This is going to, excuse me." So they sat together on the sofa, watching a tiny black and white television. As Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin stepped out onto the surface of the moon. That little girl would later tell that story for the rest of her life. But she was far from alone. Around the world, hundreds of millions of people watched the same thing. Families gathered around televisions, neighbors crowded into living rooms, people stayed up late or woke up early just to see it happen. For a moment, the entire planet seemed to stop and look in the same direction. But almost as soon as that moment happened, another question began to form. Did it really happen? Did those people actually watch astronauts land on the moon? Did Neil Armstrong really climb down that ladder? Did the Eagle really touch down on the lunar surface? Or did the world watch one of the most elaborate productions ever created? Was it science? Or was it just Hollywood? That is what we are getting into today. Before we go deep into the moon landing, the space race, the photographs, the flag, the missing stars, Stanley Kubrick, Area 51, the Van Allen belts, winter rocks, and all the strange side stories that are built up around this subject, I do want to pause for a moment. I remember seeing documentaries when I was younger about how the moon landing was supposedly faked. And I get why they worked on people. They were edited in a way that made everything sound all right. There were scars on the photos. The flag looks like it is waving. The shadow does not look right. The astronauts could never have passed through the radiation belts. The technology in the 60s was too primitive. And when you put all that together in a dramatic voice with eerie music underneath it, it can sound convincing, especially if you're not familiar with photography, space travel, physics, Cold War history, or just the basic fact that the conspiracy theories often sound strongest before anyone explains the context. That is the thing about conspiracy theories. A lot of them do not start by asking you to believe something insane. They start by asking a question that sounds reasonable. Why are there no stars? Why is the flag moving? Why do the shadows look strange? Why have we not gone back the same way? Those are not crazy questions on their own. The problem comes when people ignore the answers because the mystery is more exciting than the explanation. The moon landing conspiracy is one of the best examples of that. To understand why Apollo 11 mattered so much, you have to understand the world it happened in. During the 50s, the Cold War was in full swing. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a global competition that touched almost every part of life: military power, nuclear weapons, espionage, propaganda, technology, influence. Everything became part of the contest, and space became a race for exploration. It was about satellites, rockets, orbit, science, and discovery. But underneath that, we've got something far more serious. If you could put something in orbit, you could potentially put a weapon anywhere on Earth. That is why Sputnik changed everything. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite to orbit Earth. It was a massive achievement. For the United States, it was also a terrifying wake-up call, because if the Soviets could launch a satellite into orbit, then they had proven they had the rocket technology to send someone across continents. And that something could be a nuclear warhead. So Sputnik was not just a scientific achievement, it was a message. And the United States responded with Explorer 1 in 1958. That same year, President Dwight Eisenhower signed NASA into existence, creating the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Excuse me. Alongside that, the United States also developed top secret reconnaissance programs designed to gather intelligence on the Soviet Union from space. The race was now official. But in those early years, the Soviets kept getting there first. In 1959, Luna 2 became the first man-made object to reach the moon. Then, in 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human being to orbit Earth. The Soviet Union had beaten America into space, beaten America to the moon with a probe, and beaten America to human orbit. That was embarrassing for the United States. More than embarrassing, it was strategically dangerous. It created the perception that the Soviets were ahead, and in a Cold War world, perception mattered. So in May of 1961, President Kennedy stood before Congress and made one of the most ambitious promises in American history. He said the United States would land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the decade was out. That sentence changed everything, because at the time Kennedy said it, America had barely begun putting humans into space. The idea of landing on the moon sounded almost impossible. Kennedy understood the power of the challenge. He understood that sometimes a nation needs a goal so large that it forces everything else to move. And that is what happened. NASA's budget exploded. The Apollo program grew into one of the largest coordinated technological efforts in human history. Hundreds of thousands of people became involved, including NASA employees, engineers, contractors, universities, aerospace companies, scientists, manufacturers, and military personnel. From 1961 to 64, NASA's budget increased dramatically. The lunar landing program eventually involved tens of thousands of NASA employees and hundreds of thousands of workers from industrial and university contractors. But even with all that manpower, nobody could simply snap their fingers and say, okay, let's go to the moon. They had to figure out how. And that was not a small question. There were several possible ways to make the mission happen. The first idea was called direct descent. In simple terms, this meant launching one massive spacecraft from Earth, sending it all the way to the moon, landing the entire thing on the lunar surface, and then launching it back home. At first glance, that probably sounds like the simplest option. One ship, one mission, go there, land, come back. But the problem was size, fuel, and practicality. A spacecraft large enough to do all that would have been enormous. Landing the whole thing on the moon would have been incredibly difficult. Taking off again would require even more fuel, and the rocket needed to launch it from Earth would have been beyond what NASA could realistically build in time. The promise was to land on the moon before the end of the decade. Direct descent probably could not make that deadline. The second option, was called Earth Orbit Rendezvous. This plan involved launching different parts of the spacecraft separately and then assembling or connecting them in orbit around Earth before heading to the moon. That could have worked in theory, but it created another problem. It required multiple launches, and every launch added risk. If one rocket failed, the entire mission failed. If the docking did not work, astronauts could be stranded. It doubled the complexity at a time when NASA was already trying to solve problems nobody had solved before. Then came the third option, Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. This was the plan NASA eventually chose. A massive Saturn V rocket to launch the Apollo spacecraft towards the moon. The spacecraft would enter lunar orbit. From there, a smaller lunar module would separate from the command module and descend to the surface. Two astronauts would land, explore, collect samples, plant experiments, and then use the upper half of the lunar module to launch back into orbit. They would reconnect with the command module, leave the lunar module behind, and return home. It sounds complicated because it was complicated, but it also made sense. Instead of landing a giant spacecraft on the moon, NASA only needed to land a smaller module. Instead of carrying massive amounts of fuel for the entire craft to take off from the lunar surface, they only needed enough for the ascent stage to return to lunar orbit. It was risky, it was bold, but it was possible. And that word mattered. Possible. Because so much of the Apollo program was built around doing things that sounded impossible. Till people sat down, did the math, built the machines, tested the systems, and made them real. The road to Apollo 11 was not clean. It was not easy. It was not without tragedy. In 1967, during a ground test, what would later become known as Apollo 1, a fire broke out inside the command module. Astronauts Virgil Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee were killed. It was a devastating moment for NASA and for the country. It exposed serious design flaws and forced major changes in the Apollo spacecraft. That tragedy could have ended the program. Instead, NASA rebuilt, redesigned, and kept going. By 1968, Apollo 8 became the first crewed spacecraft to orbit the moon. That mission did not land, but it proved that humans could travel to the moon, orbit it, and return safely to Earth. The astronauts saw the far side of the moon with their own eyes. They took the famous Earthrise photograph. They showed humanity its own world hanging in the darkness. Meanwhile, the Soviet lunar program was struggling and had internal political issues, technical problems, and leadership setbacks, including the death of Sergei Korolev, chief architect of the Soviet space program. Some conspiracy-minded people have tried to turn his death into something more sinister, suggesting American involvement, but there's no credible evidence for that. By July of 1969, everything was ready to go. Apollo 11 launched from Kennedy Space Center on July 16, 1969. On board were Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. Armstrong and Aldrin would attempt the landing. Collins would remain in lunar orbit aboard the command module. The world watched. And on July 20th, 1969, the lunar module Eagle descended towards the surface. Landing was not effortless. The computer threw a alarm. The planned landing area was rougher than expected. Armstrong had to manually guide the module to a safer spot. Fuel was running low. Then came the words that entered American history. The Eagle has landed. A few hours later, Neil Armstrong climbed down the ladder, stepped onto the moon. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Buzz Aldrin followed them down, and together they became the first humans to walk on another world. That is the official story. But almost as soon as the broadcast ended, there were people who doubted it. Now, at first, moon landing denial was not some massive movement. Most people accepted what they saw. But over time, conspiracy theories grew. Books were written, claims were repeated, television specials were made. The internet arrived, and suddenly, people who believed the landing was fake could find each other, reinforce each other, and spread the idea to new audiences. And that brings us to the big question. Do any of these theories hold up? Let's start with one of the most famous, Stanley Kubrick. One of the most common claims is that NASA hired legendary filmmaker Stanley Kubrick to direct the fake moon landing footage. The argument usually goes like this. Kubrick had made the 2001 Space Odyssey, came out in 1968. The film had groundbreaking special effects. So according to the theory, NASA brought him in to stage the Apollo footage on a soundstage. Some versions of the theory even claim that Kubrick later confessed. Others claim he left clues in The Shining. People point to carpets, sweaters, room numbers, and all kinds of supposed hidden messages. But when you actually look at the evidence, it falls apart very quickly. One of the most famous supposed confession clips came from a film in which an older man appears to claim that he helped fake the moon landing. Conspiracy theorists spread it around as proof that Kubrick had admitted everything. The problem is, the man in the clip was not Stanley Kubrick. People who knew Kubrick said it was not him. His family said it was not him. And then there is even the bigger problem. The alleged interview was supposedly recorded in May 1999. Stanley Kubrick died in March 1999. So unless somebody was interviewing him from beyond the grave, that story collapses immediately. That is often how these theories work. They sound dramatic on the surface, but once you check the basic details, they just fall apart. Now, does proving that one Kubrick confession is fake prove the moon landing was real? No, but it does show that one of the most popular pieces of evidence for the hoax is not evidence at all. The next argument is the stars. This is probably one of the first moon landing conspiracy claims most people hear. In the Apollo photos, the sky appears black. There are no stars visible. So people ask, if the astronauts were really on the moon, where are the stars? It sounds suspicious until you understand cameras. The lunar surface was extremely bright. There is no atmosphere on the moon to scatter light the way Earth's atmosphere does, and the astronauts were standing in direct sunlight reflecting off the surface. Their suits and the spacecraft, the cameras were set for the bright foreground. Stars, by comparison, are very dim. To photograph stars, you need a much longer exposure. The Apollo cameras had been set to capture stars. The astronauts and the lunar surface would have been completely overexposed. The same thing happens on Earth. Go outside at night and take a picture of someone with a bright light on them. The person might show up. Stars in the background usually will not. That does not mean the stars are fake. It means the camera is exposing for the subject, not the distant points of light in the sky. So the missing stars are not proof of a hoax. They are exactly what we would expect from the camera settings used. Then there's the flag. This might be the most famous visual argument of all. People say the American flag appears to wave, even though there's no wind on it. There's no atmosphere. There should be no breeze. So why does the flag move? The answer is simple. The astronauts had to twist and rotate the pole to get it into the lunar surface. The surface was hard and compacted. They were trying to plant a flagpole into an alien landscape while wearing bulky suits. That motion caused the flag to move. Because there was no air resistance on the moon, once something moves, it does not settle the same way it would on Earth. The flag also had a horizontal support rod to make it visible, because a normal flag would just hang limp without wind. So what people interpret as waving in the wind is actually movement caused by the astronauts handling the pole. And here is another thing. If you watch the footage carefully, the flag does not continue waving on its own after the astronauts stop touching it. It moves when they move it, then it stops. That is not wind, that is physics. Then we have the lunar rocks. This is one of the strongest pieces of evidence that the moon landing were real. And it does not get talked about enough by conspiracy theorists. The Apollo missions brought back hundreds of kilograms of lunar material. Rock, dust, soil, core samples. These have all been studied by scientists around the world, not just NASA. Universities, laboratories, and researchers in different countries have examined them. And they are not just random rocks from Earth. Lunar rocks have characteristics that match what scientists would expect from material formed in the moon's environment. They show effects from cosmic radiation and micrometeorite impacts. They lack the kind of weathering caused by Earth's atmosphere and water. The Soviet Union also returned lunar samples through robotic missions, but those missions brought back only a small amount compared to Apollo. The Apollo samples were far larger in quantity. Some conspiracy theorists argue that NASA could have collected the rocks using robotic probes. But that creates another problem. NASA had the ability to collect hundreds of kilograms of lunar rock robotically in secret, launch all those missions without detection, return the samples, and then fake the human landing. That operation would have been so complex and expensive that it would almost make more sense to just go to the moon. And that is one of the ironies of the moon hoax theory. In many versions, the hoax becomes harder to pull off than the actual mission. Next, let's talk about the Van Allen belts. This argument comes up constantly. The Van Allen belt is zones of charged particles trapped by Earth's magnetic field. They contain radiation, so the claim is that astronauts could not have passed through them without being killed. Again, this sounds scary until you look at the details. Yes, the belts are real. Yes, radiation is a real concern in space. NASA knew that, and that is why the Apollo missions were planned to pass through the belts quickly and through less intense regions. The spacecraft also provided shielding. Radiation exposure depends on intensity and time. Passing through a dangerous area quickly is not the same as sitting inside it for hours or days. The Apollo astronauts did receive radiation exposure, but not at levels that would have killed them or cooked them, as some conspiracy theories claim. There was a risk, but it was a calculated and managed risk. This is important because conspiracy theories often take a real thing and exaggerate it. The Van Allen belts are real. The danger is real. The conclusion that they made the moon landing impossible is not supported by the evidence. Then there is the physical evidence left on the moon. The Apollo mission left equipment behind. The descent stages of lunar modules, scientific instruments, footprints, rover tracks, and most importantly, retroreflectors. These reflectors were placed on the lunar surface so that lasers from the Earth could be bounced off them to measure the distance between Earth and the moon with incredible precision. Scientists still use lunar laser ranging today, and now conspiracy theorists will sometimes say that reflectors could have been placed by unmanned missions. Technically, unmanned missions can place reflectors. The Soviets did that. But again, that does not explain the full body of evidence. It does not explain the samples, the photographs, the transmissions, the tracking data, the independent observers, and the sheer number of people involved. There are also images taken by later lunar orbiters showing the Apollo landing sites. You can see equipment and tracks. Of course, people who are deeply committed to the hoax theory will say those images are fake too. And that is a problem. Once someone decides every piece of evidence is part of the cover-up, no evidence can ever be enough. That is not skepticism. That is a closed loop. Now let's talk about one of the more interesting arguments. What happened after Apollo 11 disappeared from view. Some conspiracy theorists accept that the rocket launched. After all, thousands of people saw it. They do not deny that part. Instead, they claimed Apollo 11 went to Earth orbit and stayed there, while NASA played pre-recorded footage of a fake moon landing. But that theory also has problems. Apollo 11 was not being tracked only by NASA. The Soviets were watching. Other countries were watching. Radio operators were listening. Observatories and tracking stations followed the mission. If Apollo 11 had remained in Earth orbit, it would have been detectable. The Soviets had every reason to detect it. There is also the story of amateur radio operator Larry Lease, who reportedly built equipment to listen in on Apollo 11 transmissions. His antenna had to be pointed at the moon, and as the moon moved relative to Earth, he had to adjust it to keep receiving the signal. And that is exactly what you would expect. The signal was coming from the moon, not from low Earth orbit. Now, could a conspiracy theorist say the signal came from an unmanned spacecraft orbiting the moon? Sure, they can always add another layer. But again, every added layer makes the conspiracy bigger and more complicated, thus being harder to hide. At a certain point, the explanation becomes more unbelievable than the thing it is trying to disprove. And that is where moon landing conspiracy theories often end up. Because once you accept that the rocket launched, then you have to explain where it went. If it went to orbit, you have to explain why nobody tracked it staying there. If it went to the moon but was unmanned, you have to explain the transmissions, the samples, the equipment, the photographs, the astronauts, the later missions, and why nobody involved ever exposed it. Then you have to explain why the Soviet Union did not expose it. Then you have to explain why later scientists, engineers, and international agencies all went along with it. Then you have to explain why private researchers and independent experts have never produced definitive proof of the fraud. By the time you are done, the hoax requires a level of global coordination and silence that is almost impossible to believe. But not every theory is even that grounded. Some of them are just ridiculous. There is one story that claims the Apollo 11 astronauts were not in space at all, but were instead partying at a casino in Las Vegas during the mission. According to this story, someone recognized them, took photos, and then had the camera confiscated by mysterious officials. Now let's just think about this for a second. NASA were trying to fake the most important mission in human history, and if Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins were not actually on board the spacecraft, they really let them walk around Las Vegas in public? Of course not. It would have been hidden away somewhere with no access to the outside world. No cameras, no witnesses. No chance of seeing someone. The idea that NASA would spend enormous amounts of money staging a fake moon landing and then let the three most recognizable men involved go gambling in a casino is absurd. But that is how some conspiracy stories work. They are not built to survive scrutiny. They are built to sound shocking. Then there are the claims about aliens on the moon. Some writers, conspiracy personalities have claimed that NASA discovered evidence of alien activity on the lunar surface and has been hiding it ever since. At some point, the photographs of rocks and tracks and claim they show alien mining machines or giant vehicles. In many cases, the machines are just rocks. The tracks are natural marks caused by boulders rolling or shifting across the surface, sometimes due to moonquakes or impacts. But if you're looking for aliens, every shadow becomes a doorway, every rock becomes a vehicle, every blur becomes a structure, every image becomes evidence. It does not mean the evidence is actually there. It means the person looking at it has already decided what they want to find. And that is a theme that runs through all of this. People often say, I'm just asking questions. And asking questions is fine. We should test official stories. We should demand evidence. We should be careful about government claims, especially when history has shown that governments do lie, hide information, and protect their own interests. But asking questions is not the same as rejecting every answer. Skepticism requires standards. If you question the official story, you also have to question the alternative. You cannot demand perfect evidence from NASA while accepting random internet claims, fake confessions, blurry photos, and anonymous stories without question. That is not critical thinking. That is selective disbelief. Now, one of the reasons the moon landing conspiracy has lasted so long is because it touches on something real: distrust. People do not trust institutions the way they once did. And honestly, there are reasons for that. Governments have lied. Intelligence agencies have hidden operations. Corporations have covered up dangers. Officials have misled the public. History is full of examples. So when people hear the government says this happened, some immediately think, oh, maybe it did. And that instinct is understandable. But distrust alone is not evidence. Just because the government has lied about some things does not mean every major event is fake. Just because NASA is a government agency does not mean Apollo 11 was staged. Just because a claim feels suspicious does not mean the alternative is true. The moon landing happened in the middle of one of the most hostile geopolitical rivalries in history. The US had enemies watching. The Soviet Union had scientists, spies, tracking stations, and propaganda outlets. If America faked the landing, the Soviets would have every incentive to expose it. Instead, they acknowledged the achievement. The fact alone does not settle every technical question, but it is incredibly powerful because the moon landing was not performed in a vacuum, no pun intended. It was performed under the watchful eye of the world. Another thing people forget is that Apollo 11 was not the only moon landing. NASA sent multiple missions to the lunar surface. Apollo 12 landed later in 1969. Apollo 14, 15, 16, and 17 followed. Apollo 13 famously failed to land because of an oxygen tank explosion, but the crew survived and returned home. In total, 12 astronauts walked on the moon. So if you believe the moon landings were fake, you're not just claiming Apollo 11 was staged, you're claiming NASA faked multiple missions, multiple launches, multiple crews, multiple sets of samples, multiple sets of photographs, multiple scientific experiments, and multiple live broadcasts. And nobody credibly exposed it. Not one astronaut gave a deathbed confession. Not one engineer came forward with documents proving the hoax. Not one Soviet intelligence breakthrough revealed it. Not one contractor leaked the soundstage. Not one camera operator, lighting technician, or set designer produced the smoking gun. For a small secret, silence is possible. For a secret involving hundreds of thousands of people over decades, silence becomes almost impossible. That is why the human element matters so much. Think about Watergate. That involved a much smaller group of people, and it fell apart. Think about classified documents that leak. Think about military secrets that eventually surface. Think about how hard it is for any major institution to keep something hidden forever. Now imagine trying to hide the fake moon landing for more than 50 years across administrations, agencies, countries, generations. That is a very hard thing to believe. Now, some people will say, well, maybe only a small group knew, but that does not solve the problem. The mission required real engineering, real rockets, real tracking, real communications, real astronauts, real equipment, real recovery operations, real scientific samples, real manufacturing, real contracts. Most people involved believed it was real, and the fake operations would still need to create enough real world data to fool the very people building and operating it. Again, at that point, the hoax becomes more complicated than the mission. One of the things that fascinates me about this conspiracy is how much it relies on underestimating the people of the 60s. People will say they did not have the technology, but they did. Not the technology we have today, not smartphones, not laptops, not the kind of commuting power we casually carry in our pockets. But they had the specific technology needed for the mission. They had rockets, they had guidance systems, they had engineers who understood orbital mechanics, they had test pilots, they had mathematicians, they had manufacturing capacity, they had enormous funding, they had national urgency. You did not need an iPhone to go to the moon. You need the right systems, designed for the right purpose, with enough testing and enough people solving enough problems. The Apollo guidance computer was primitive compared to modern devices, but it was not useless, it was specialized. It did what it needed to do. And the astronauts were not just passengers, they were highly trained pilots and engineers. Armstrong manually controlled the landing during the final descent. These were not people sitting back while a computer did everything, they were part of the system. That is another reason the story is so remarkable. It was not easy, it was dangerous, and nearly failed. People died during the program. Mistakes were made, systems had to be designed or redesigned. Apollo 11 itself had tense moments. The famous landing was not some clean Hollywood sequence where everything goes perfectly. It was messy, risky, and human, and that makes it feel more real, not less. Now let's go back to the photographs and shadows, because that is another common argument. Conspiracy theorists often say the shadows in Apollo photos fall in different directions, which they claim proves they were multiple studio lights. But the lunar surface is uneven. Terrain slopes, camera angles, lens distortion, and perspective can make shadows appear non-parallel in a two-dimensional image. You can recreate similar effects on Earth with one light source, uneven ground, and perspective. You do not need multiple lights. People also point to the quality of the photos and say, they look too good. But NASA trained the astronauts. The cameras were designed for the mission. The photos that became famous were selected from many images. Not every shot taken. There were bad photos too, blurry ones, poorly framed ones, accidental ones. We tend to see the iconic images and forget that they are the highlights. That is true of almost everything historical. We remember the polished moments, not the hundreds of imperfect pieces around them. Then there is the claim that the astronauts would not have been able to move the way they did. Some say the footage looks slowed down. Others say the astronauts were suspended by wires. But when you look at how objects move in the footage, especially dust, it behaves in a way consistent with low gravity and no atmosphere. Dust kicked up by the rover falls back down in clean arcs without billowing like it would in air. That is hard to fake convincingly in 1969. Not impossible in theory, but extremely difficult, especially across all the footage, all the missions, and all the angles. Again, the fake has to become more advanced than the reality. Now I want to talk about something darker for a moment, because one of the most haunting pieces of Apollo history, not about the landing itself, it is about what would have happened if Armstrong and Aldrin had not come home. Before the landing, a speech was prepared for President Nixon in case the astronauts were stranded on the moon. The speech was titled "In Event of Moon Disaster." It was written in case the lunar module could not lift off, leaving Armstrong and Aldrin trapped on the lunar surface with no hope of rescue. That speech is chilling. It acknowledged that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace would remain there to rest in peace. It spoke of their sacrifice, their families, their nation, and the people of the world. It imagined future generations looking up at the moon and knowing that some corner of another world was forever mankind. That document reminds us how dangerous this mission really was. This was not a guaranteed victory lap. This was not a staged celebration. NASA knew there was a real chance these men might die on live television or be left on the moon till their oxygen ran out. That possibility was real enough that the White House prepared words for it. And to me, that adds weight to the story. It reminds us that Apollo 11 was not just a technical achievement, it was a gamble, a brave one, a dangerous one, a moment where human beings went farther than anyone had ever gone, knowing they might not come back. Now, could someone still say the speech was part of the cover story? Sure, but again, once every document, every witness, every technical explanation, every sample, every image, every signal, and every historical record becomes part of the cover up, we're no longer dealing with evidence. We're dealing with belief, and belief can be very hard to break. That brings us to another important point. Why do people believe this? Some people believe it because they truly think the evidence does not add up. Some believe it because they distrust the government. Some believe it because they saw a documentary or read a book that presented the conspiracy as fact. Some believe it because the idea of a secret this big is exciting. It makes the world feel like a puzzle, and they feel like they are among the few who can see through the lie. That feeling can be powerful, and conspiracy theories often offer a kind of control. They take huge, complicated events and turn them into stories with villains, secrets, and hidden truth. Instead of accepting that history is messy, difficult, and sometimes awe inspiring, the conspiracy gives you a simpler answer. They lied. Sometimes the truth is more extraordinary than the lie. The truth is that human beings built machines powerful enough to escape Earth. They send people across hundreds of thousands of miles of space. They landed on another world using technology that seemed primitive to us now, but was cutting edge for the time. They collected samples, performed experiments, returned home, and changed humanity's understanding of what was possible. It is belief in one conspiracy can become a gateway to others. Studies have shown that people who believe in one major conspiracy theory are often more likely to believe in others. That does not mean everyone who questions the moon landing is dangerous, but it does show how patterns of distrust can spread. If someone starts with the moon landing was fake, they may move to vaccines are fake, climate change is fake, elections are fake, every tragedy is staged, or a secret group controls everything. And unlike a moon landing debate, some of these beliefs can directly harm people. That is where this stops being just a funny argument at Thanksgiving and starts becoming serious. Because once people lose the ability to sort evidence from rumor, everything becomes suspicious. Experts become enemies. Facts become opinions. History becomes whatever story gets the most clicks. That is a dangerous place for society to be. Now, I'm not saying people should never question official narratives. They should. We should. That's healthy. But healthy skepticism has to be paired with intellectual honesty. You have to be willing to accept strong evidence, even when it goes against the theory you like. And with the moon landing, the evidence points overwhelmingly in one direction. We went and came back. Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon. Michael Collins orbited above them, alone, waiting to bring them home. Apollo 11 happened. So did the missions that followed. It remains one of the greatest achievements in human history. Now, before we wrap this up, I want to return to the point I made at the beginning because I think it is the strongest one. The Soviets were watching. They were not passive observers. They were America's rivals. They were in a race with the U.S. They had already beaten America to several major milestones in space. If Apollo 11 had been fake, exposing it would have been one of the greatest propaganda victories in Soviet history. They would have humiliated the United States in front of the entire world. But they did not because they knew Apollo 11 went to the moon. That does not mean they were happy about it. It does not mean they celebrated it, but they accepted the reality of it because they were tracking the same reality everyone else was. And that, to me, is where the hoax theory runs into its biggest wall. It asks us to believe that the United States fooled not only its own citizens, not only its own scientists, not only the media, not only the astronauts' families, not only the entire NASA workforce, but also the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War. That is a lot to believe. More than that, it asks us to believe that nobody credible has ever broken the story open in more than half a century. No real confession, no verified document, no undeniable leak, no exposed soundstage, no missing link that proves the whole thing was theater. Just questions, misunderstandings, fake clips, blurry photos, recycled claims, and a belief that the official story must be false because it came from an institution. But sometimes the official story is true. Sometimes the impossible thing really happened. And in July of 1969, with the world watching, human beings left Earth, crossed the darkness, landed on the moon, and came back. It's not just an American story, it's a human story. Maybe that is why the conspiracy has lasted so long, because the achievement itself is almost too big to comprehend. It feels unreal, feels mythic, feels like something out of science fiction. But it was real, and that might be the most incredible part of it all. The moon landing was not a hoax. It was not a Hollywood production, not filmed in the desert, not directed by Stanley Kubrick. It was not a trick played on the world. It was the result of ambition, fear, competition, science, sacrifice, engineering, risk, and human courage. And more than 50 years later, still stands as one of the clearest examples of what people can do when they decide that the impossible is worth attempting. So the next time someone says we never went to the moon, the answer is not just yes, we did. The answer is we went because the world was watching. We went because the Soviets were watching. We went because thousands of people built the machines, solved the problems, took the risk. We went because the evidence says we went. We went because for one brief moment in history, humanity looked up at the night sky and decided that being stuck on Earth was not enough. That is where we are going to leave it for today. Thank you so much for listening and watching. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments section what you think. Do you believe the moon landing conspiracy is harmless fun? Or do you think it opens the door to something more dangerous? As always, I am Larry Lease, and this has been another brand new episode of the Dead Reckoning Show. Till next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, always follow the evidence.